When we speak of God, of the soul, and of that mysterious landscape we call the inner world, we are not merely engaging in abstract philosophy, but touching the very roots of human existence. Carl Jung taught us that beneath the surface of ordinary life, there lies a vast unconscious filled with archetypes, symbols, and spiritual truths that shape our destiny. To speak of God is to speak of the deepest reality mirrored within the human psyche. To speak of the soul is to speak of that eternal spark that seeks wholeness beyond the confines of time. And to speak of the inner world is to invite each of us into the sacred task of self-discovery, where dreams, visions, and struggles reveal pathways to transformation. This is not a journey of escaping life, but of entering it fully, seeing how the divine and the human are woven together in the hidden chambers of our being. A Carl Jung's exploration of God and the human psyche through the lens of archetypes and the collective unconscious is one of the most profound contributions to modern psychology. And yet it reaches far beyond the realm of clinical analysis into the domain of philosophy, spirituality, and theology. When Jung speaks of God, he does not limit the term to any one particular religious doctrine or creed, nor does he reduce it to a mere cultural invention. Instead, he treats God as an archetype, an image that arises spontaneously from the collective unconscious, pointing to a reality that transcends the conscious mind and cannot be contained by rational thought alone. In Jung's framework, God is both a symbol and a living experience, a presence within the psyche that speaks in the language of dreams, visions, and myth, urging the human being to orient life toward a greater whole. The archetypal idea of God is one of the most universal phenomena across human cultures, appearing in varied forms throughout history, and Jung sees this not as an accident, but as evidence of a deep structure embedded in the psyche itself. The God image, as he calls it, is not manufactured by human reasoning, but rather discovered within the depths of human experience. It emerges when the unconscious communicates its truths, whether through religious ritual, mystical experience, or symbolic expression, and it reveals to us that the human soul is wired for transcendence. In the collective unconscious, archetypes operate as primordial images, patterns of thought and behavior that shape our perception of reality even before we are aware of them. Among these, the archetype of God holds a unique position, for it addresses the ultimate questions of existence. Who am I? What is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of suffering? This archetype compels humanity to seek orientation, to look for a center around which life can be ordered. Jung often described God as the image of the self, the archetype of wholeness and unity that resides at the core of the unconscious. The self is that dimension of the psyche that transcends the ego, guiding individuals toward integration and individuation. And the God image is one of the primary ways the self makes itself known. Thus, when people encounter God in dreams, in symbols, or in religious experiences, they are encountering not a fabrication, but a profound psychic reality that points them beyond themselves toward the fullness of being. Jung's insight is that the psyche has a natural tendency to produce images of God, because the human being cannot live without orientation toward a greater totality. When the God archetype is ignored, denied, or repressed, the result is often psychological imbalance, manifesting as emptiness, anxiety, or destructive behaviors. This is why Jung believed that modern man's crisis was not only social or economic, but spiritual, a loss of connection with the archetypal experience of God. Without such connection, the ego tends to inflate, mistaking itself for the center of life, and in doing so, it collapses under the weight of responsibilities it was never meant to bear. The God archetype serves as a counterbalance to ego inflation, reminding the human being of their limited but meaningful place within a vast cosmos. To Jung, the religious instinct is as natural as the instinct to eat or to love, and its repression produces neurosis. Religion, whether institutional or personal, is the psyche's attempt to mediate the experience of the archetypal God and to orient the individual to the depths of the unconscious. Jung saw this dynamic most vividly in dreams. In countless case studies, he observed how images of divinity, light, mandalas, or transcendent figures would arise in the dreams of patients, even those who consciously rejected religion. These images were not arbitrary. They carried the numinous quality that Rudolf Otto described as mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the sense of awe, fear, and attraction in the presence of the divine. For Jung, such experiences signaled the presence of the archetype of God working to restore balance within the psyche. If a person felt alienated, lost, or fragmented, the unconscious would often supply an image of the divine to call them back to wholeness. This suggests that the human mind is not merely rational or mechanical, but fundamentally symbolic, oriented toward meaning, and that God is one of the most powerful symbols it can generate. Yet for Jung, to call it a symbol does not mean it is less real, but rather that its reality exceeds direct definition, pointing toward a mystery that no single doctrine can exhaust. The universality of God archetypes across cultures fascinated Jung. He studied Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, alchemy, Gnosticism, and indigenous traditions, noting how each contained images of the divine that mirrored one another in striking ways. The Christian image of Christ as mediator, the Hindu Atman Brahman union, the Buddhist mandala of enlightenment, the alchemical philosopher's stone, all pointed to the same underlying psychic reality, the quest for the self, the unification of opposites, the reconciliation of the finite with the infinite. These diverse God images were not proof of illusion, but proof of the depth of the archetype, adapting itself to different cultural contexts while retaining its essential structure. For Jung, the task of the modern person was not to discard these images as primitive superstitions, but to understand them as windows into the psyche's attempt to articulate its deepest truths. Central to Jung's perspective was the idea that the God archetype reveals the limits of the ego. The ego, necessary for conscious life, tends to assume it is the master of existence. It believes it can control fate, explain reality, and dictate meaning. But encounters with the archetype of God shatter this illusion, humbling the ego and forcing it to recognize a higher order. This is why religious experiences are often accompanied by feelings of awe or terror. The realization that one stands before something immeasurably greater. For Jung, this confrontation is psychologically essential because without it, the ego becomes a tyrant, cut off from the deeper currents of life. The God archetype restores humility, grounding the ego in its proper place as servant of the self rather than usurper of the whole. Jung was careful to distinguish between the God archetype and any theological assertion about God's existence. He did not see himself as proving or disproving God in a metaphysical sense, but as describing the undeniable psychological reality that human beings experience God images. For him, the fact that such images emerge spontaneously across cultures and eras demonstrates their importance. Whether or not one believes in God as an external being, the God archetype remains a living force in the psyche, shaping behavior, values, and destiny. To deny it is to deny a part of oneself, and to repress it is to risk imbalance. This is why Jung once wrote that the question is not whether God exists, but how the image of God exists within us, how it speaks to us, and how we respond to it. The archetype insists upon being recognized, and when it is ignored, it often reappears in distorted forms through ideologies, obsessions, or projections onto authority figures, each carrying the weight of misplaced divinity. Another important dimension of Jung's thought is that the God archetype is not static, but dynamic. It evolves with the development of consciousness, revealing new facets as humanity matures. In early cultures, the gods were external, embodied in nature or polytheistic figures. Later, the monotheistic image of God emerged, emphasizing unity and transcendence. Jung believed that in the modern era, the God archetype was moving inward, presenting itself not merely as an external lawgiver, but as an inner presence calling individuals toward individuation. This shift does not negate the old forms, but transforms them, integrating the outer with the inner, the transcendent with the immanent. In this way, the archetype of God continues to guide humanity's spiritual evolution, adapting its form, but retaining its essential function of orienting the psyche toward wholeness. In practice, this meant that Jung encouraged individuals to take their inner experiences seriously, whether they came through dreams, visions, or religious practices. He urged them not to dismiss these as fantasy, but to recognize them as communications from the unconscious, carrying the wisdom of the archetype. He also emphasized the importance of symbols, the cross, the mandala, the circle, the light, because symbols bridge the gap between the conscious mind and the unconscious depths. They allow the ego to engage with realities it cannot fully comprehend, serving as mediators of the divine. The God archetype speaks through these symbols not to enslave the individual to dogma, but to invite them into a living dialogue with the depths of their own soul. Jung's perspective offers a profound challenge to modern secularism. In a world where many dismiss religion as outdated, he insists that the religious function of the psyche remains as vital as ever. The archetype of God cannot be erased by disbelief. It will reassert itself in new forms, whether in politics, science, or personal obsessions. The only question is whether we will recognize it consciously and integrate it into our lives, or whether we will repress it and suffer the consequences of imbalance. For Jung, the wise path is integration, to allow the God image to remind us of our place within the whole and to guide us toward individuation. In this sense, the archetype of God is not merely about belief, but about psychological health, for without it, we risk living fragmented, disconnected lives. Thus, to speak of God in Jungian psychology is to speak of the deepest structures of the human psyche, the archetypal patterns that orient us toward wholeness and meaning. It is to acknowledge that the quest for God is not only a matter of theology, but of psychology, not only of external worship, but of inner discovery. The God archetype reveals that within each person lies an orientation toward the transcendent, a drive to seek, to worship, to unite with something greater than the self. It reveals that our inner world is not barren, but filled with symbols pointing toward the divine. It reveals that the human soul is, at its core, a mirror of the infinite. The role of the soul in Carl Jung's psychology is inseparable from his vision of individuation and the movement toward spiritual wholeness. For the soul is not merely a theological abstraction or a poetic metaphor, but the living center of our inner life, the mediator between the conscious mind and the vast depths of the unconscious. Jung does not treat the soul as a substance to be measured or as a doctrine to be dogmatically defended, but rather as an experiential reality that emerges in the daily drama of human existence. It is through the soul that we come into contact with both our deepest wounds and our highest possibilities, for it is the seat of imagination, emotion, intuition, and spiritual longing. In Jung's view, the soul's fundamental task is to guide the human being toward individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole by reconciling the conscious and unconscious dimensions of the psyche. Individuation is not about perfection in the sense of flawlessness, but about completeness, about bringing together light and shadow, reason and mystery, the finite ego and the infinite self. The soul, therefore, is the compass pointing us toward this journey, urging us to engage with the mysteries of life rather than to escape them. Jung often spoke of the anima and animus, the inner feminine in men and the inner masculine in women, as expressions of the soul archetype. These inner figures appear in dreams, fantasies, and projections, guiding individuals toward balance by forcing them to recognize what is lacking or undeveloped within themselves. For a man, the anima might appear as a woman in a dream, embodying qualities of sensitivity, intuition, or receptivity that his conscious life has neglected. For a woman, the animus might appear as a man representing reason, authority, or determination, qualities that her conscious self may not yet have integrated. These figures are not merely psychological constructs, but embodiments of the soul's role as mediator, pulling the conscious mind into dialogue with the unconscious. The anima and animus, therefore, are not obstacles but guides, inviting us to acknowledge the fullness of our being and to bridge the gap between opposites. In this way, the soul becomes the doorway to transformation, teaching us that wholeness requires integration rather than repression. The soul also functions as a bridge between the human being and the divine. Jung argued that the experience of God is mediated through the soul, not because the soul invents God, but because the psyche provides the symbolic framework through which divine reality is encountered. In other words, without the soul, God would remain abstract and unreachable. With the soul, God becomes experienced in dreams, symbols, visions, and rituals. The soul then is both receptive and creative. Receptive in that it allows the divine to impress itself upon us, and creative in that it gives form to that impression through images and myths. This is why Jung believed that neglecting the soul leads to spiritual impoverishment, while cultivating it leads to a sense of depth, orientation, and meaning. The soul is not content with superficial answers or with a life of pure materialism. It continually pushes us toward questions of purpose, destiny, and eternity. Even when ignored, it makes its presence known through restlessness, dissatisfaction, or crisis, reminding us that we are called to more than survival. We are called to wholeness. Jung saw individuation as a spiritual path, precisely because it is guided by the soul's yearning for wholeness. The process often begins with suffering or conflict, moments when the ego is forced to recognize its limitations. In these moments, the soul speaks through symbols, dreams of journeys, encounters with wise figures, visions of light or mandalas, all pointing toward integration. The individual is invited to descend into the depths of the unconscious, to face the shadow, to acknowledge the repressed and unwanted aspects of the self. This descent is not destruction, but initiation. For the soul knows that only by confronting the shadow can we discover the gold hidden within it. The soul urges us not to deny our darkness, but to integrate it, to hold together the paradoxes of life rather than splitting them apart. It knows that wholeness lies not in purity, but in the embrace of complexity, in the unification of opposites. This is why Jung often compared the soul's work to alchemy. It takes the raw material of human experience, even the most painful or ugly parts, and transforms them into symbols of growth and renewal. Dreams, for Jung, were one of the soul's primary languages. He treated dreams not as random neurological events, but as messages from the unconscious, carefully crafted expressions of the psyche's attempt to restore balance. In dreams, the soul presents us with images that reveal both our wounds and our possibilities, often through symbols that resist literal interpretation. A dream of water might symbolize the unconscious. A dream of a house might symbolize the self. A dream of a journey might symbolize the path of individuation. To dismiss such dreams is to silence the soul's voice, but to engage with them is to enter into dialogue with the deepest parts of oneself. Jung encouraged individuals to record, reflect upon, and even interact with their dreams, for in doing so they honored the soul's guidance and allowed its wisdom to shape their conscious life. Active imagination was another method Jung developed to engage the soul. This practice involved consciously entering into dialogue with images or figures from the unconscious, allowing them to speak and reveal their meaning. Through active imagination, the soul could present its wisdom in a living, dynamic way, not as abstract theory, but as direct experience. A person might encounter the anima, the shadow, a symbolic figure of God in these imaginal dialogues, and by engaging with them, they would integrate new aspects of themselves. Active imagination thus became a sacred practice, a way of listening to the soul and allowing it to guide the process of individuation. For Jung, this was not fantasy or self-delusion, but a disciplined means of encountering the inner world with openness and respect. The soul also plays a central role in Jung's understanding of suffering. For him, suffering is not meaningless, but often the very path by which the soul brings transformation. When life collapses, when old identities fail, when meaning seems lost, the soul is at work dismantling the false structures of the ego and preparing the way for renewal. This is why Jung often emphasized the importance of bearing the tension of opposites, holding both despair and hope, light and darkness, weakness and strength, without prematurely resolving them. The soul thrives in this tension, for it is in the crucible of opposites that transformation occurs. The person who can endure this tension allows the self to emerge more fully, guided by the soul's wisdom. Thus, suffering, though painful, becomes the very soil of individuation, the place where wholeness takes root. In the religious and mystical traditions Jung studied, the soul was often portrayed as the bride of God, the vessel of divine union. He interpreted these traditions psychologically, seeing in them the symbolic expression of the individuation process. The longing of the soul for God mirrored the psyche's longing for the self, the archetype of wholeness that unites the finite and the infinite. Mystics spoke of union with God, while Jung spoke of the integration of the self, yet he saw these as parallel expressions of the same reality. The soul, therefore, is the meeting place of human and divine, the place where the archetype of God is experienced and where the self is realized. To listen to the soul is to listen to the deepest truth of one's existence. The truth that life is not merely about survival or adaptation, but about becoming whole, becoming a vessel of the divine within the human. Jung's understanding of the soul challenges modern reductionism, which often seeks to explain human life purely in terms of biology or social conditioning. For Jung, such explanations miss the depth dimension, the reality that human beings are not only physical and social, but also symbolic and spiritual. The soul cannot be reduced to neurons or instincts, because it speaks in the language of meaning, purpose, and transcendence. It is the part of us that dreams, imagines, and longs for eternity. Without it, we are left with surfaces, with mechanisms and functions, but no depth, no story, no destiny. With it, life becomes a journey of discovery, a pilgrimage toward the center of the self, guided by the whispers of the unconscious and the call of the divine. The soul also resists uniformity, for it speaks uniquely to each individual. Jung emphasized that no two paths of individuation are the same, because the soul reveals itself in personal symbols and experiences. What appears in one person's dreams may differ completely from another's, yet both point toward wholeness. This is why Jung opposed rigid dogmas that demand uniform belief or practice. For him, the soul's guidance is deeply personal, and to ignore one's own inner experience in favor of external authority is to betray the soul's calling. Religion, at its best, provides symbols and rituals that support the soul's journey, but when it becomes oppressive or denies the individual's inner truth, it alienates the soul and stifles growth. The true task, Jung believed, is to honor the soul's voice, to discern its symbols, and to allow them to shape one's life in authenticity and wholeness. In this way, the soul becomes the true guide of the human journey. It knows the way to wholeness, even when the conscious mind is lost. It speaks through dreams, symbols, and imagination, offering guidance that reason alone cannot provide. It pushes us to confront our shadows, to integrate what we have repressed, to embrace the paradoxes of existence. It draws us toward God, not as a concept, but as a living presence experienced in the depths of the psyche. It teaches us that suffering can be a path to transformation, that meaning can be found in the midst of chaos, and that wholeness is possible even in the face of imperfection. For Jung, the soul is not a relic of superstition, but the living reality of the inner world, the mediator of individuation, the guide to spiritual wholeness, and the voice that continually reminds us that life's deepest purpose is not to escape ourselves, but to become ourselves fully. The exploration of the inner world through dreams, symbols, and active imagination is one of Carl Jung's most distinctive contributions, for he understood that the psyche does not reveal itself primarily through rational concepts, but through images, stories, and archetypes that emerge from the depths of the unconscious. To Jung, the unconscious is not a mere repository of repressed memories or instincts, as Freud often emphasized, but a living dimension of the psyche filled with wisdom, creativity, and spiritual significance. It is a hidden landscape that contains not only the personal unconscious, those forgotten or suppressed experiences of an individual life, but also the collective unconscious, the shared reservoir of archetypes and primordial patterns common to all humanity. To engage with the inner world is to step into this mysterious terrain where the boundaries between self and universe blur, where symbols carry meanings that transcend personal biography, and where the soul encounters both its shadow and its light. Jung believed that neglecting this inner world leaves a person fragmented, while exploring it allows for transformation and individuation, the process of becoming whole. Dreams were, for Jung, the royal road into this inner world. Unlike Freud, who saw dreams largely as disguised fulfillments of repressed wishes, Jung considered them spontaneous messages from the unconscious, aimed at restoring balance and guiding the individual toward wholeness. Dreams, in his view, are not trivial or meaningless, but carefully structured symbolic narratives in which the unconscious communicates truths that the conscious mind has overlooked or denied. For example, a person struggling with pride might dream of being humbled, while one overwhelmed by despair might dream of light breaking into darkness. These images are not random but compensatory, balancing the conscious attitude and pointing toward integration. The soul uses dreams as a kind of secret language, weaving together archetypal symbols with personal content, inviting the dreamer to listen and respond. To dismiss dreams is to silence the psyche's own voice, but to engage them is to enter into dialogue with the unconscious and to uncover its wisdom. Jung emphasized that dream symbols should not be interpreted in a fixed or dogmatic way, but understood within the context of the dreamer's life. A snake in one dream might represent danger or temptation, while in another it might symbolize healing and transformation, recalling the serpent of alchemy or the staff of Asclepius. Water might signify the unconscious depths, rebirth, or the flow of life, depending on the context. Jung resisted simplistic formulas because he saw symbols as living, dynamic expressions that could not be reduced to a single definition. Instead, he encouraged individuals to reflect on their dreams, to explore associations, and to see how the symbols resonated with their personal journey. At the same time, he recognized that many dream images belong to the collective unconscious, appearing across cultures and times with remarkable consistency. Archetypes such as the hero, the wise old man, the mother, the shadow, or the divine child emerge in dreams, not only as personal figures, but as expressions of universal patterns guiding the psyche toward growth. To encounter these figures is to touch something larger than oneself, to glimpse the shared architecture of the human soul. Beyond dreams, Jung turned to symbols as another primary mode of engaging the inner world. For him, symbols are not mere signs or substitutes for known things, but bridges between the conscious and unconscious, pointing toward realities that cannot be fully grasped by reason alone. A symbol always carries more meaning than can be explained, and this excess of meaning is what makes it powerful. Religious images, myths, rituals, and even works of art serve as symbolic expressions of unconscious realities. Jung devoted much of his career to studying such symbols, from Christian theology to Eastern mandalas, from alchemical texts to tribal myths, recognizing in them recurring patterns that revealed the psyche's striving toward wholeness. He often described the mandala, a circular image with a center, as one of the most potent symbols of the self, representing the unification of opposites and the harmony of the psyche. Patients would spontaneously draw mandalas in their art or dreams, often during periods of crisis or transition, as the unconscious sought to bring order and orientation. For Jung, this was not mere coincidence, but evidence of the inner world's natural tendency to express itself symbolically in the pursuit of balance. Active imagination was Jung's most original method for exploring the inner world. It involved entering into a conscious dialogue with images and figures that arose from the unconscious, allowing them to unfold rather than suppressing or dismissing them. For example, if a person dreamt of a wise old man, they might, in active imagination, visualize this figure, speak with him, and record the conversation. In doing so, they engaged directly with the archetype, allowing its meaning to emerge in a personal way. Similarly, someone might paint or draw their inner images, not as artistic performances, but as acts of listening to the soul. Active imagination thus gave form to the unconscious, creating a bridge between inner and outer life. Jung himself practiced it extensively, as recorded in his Red Book, where he engaged with symbolic figures such as Philemon, who became for him a guide and teacher of wisdom. Through such dialogues, the unconscious was not treated as an enemy or a dark pit to be avoided, but as a living partner in the journey of individuation. Active imagination requires openness and courage, for it often brings one face to face with shadow elements, fear, rage, or pain, that the ego prefers to deny. Yet by engaging these figures, rather than repressing them, one integrates their energy into consciousness, leading to greater wholeness. Jung believed that the exploration of the inner world was essential for modern humanity, especially in a time when outer achievements often overshadow inner life. He observed that people who ignored their unconscious often felt restless, fragmented, or trapped in compulsions they could not understand. The inner world would not remain silent. It would erupt in neuroses, anxieties, or projections onto others if not consciously engaged. For Jung, the great task of modern man was not only to master the external world through science and technology, but also to rediscover the symbolic dimension of existence, to re-establish contact with the unconscious and its guidance. This did not mean abandoning reason or science, but complementing them with an openness to symbols, dreams, and imagination, recognizing that human life is more than mechanisms and calculations. Without the inner world, life becomes shallow, disconnected from meaning. With it, life becomes a journey of discovery, oriented by images that connect the individual to the collective and to the divine. The shadow was one of the most challenging aspects of the inner world that Jung explored. The shadow represents those qualities and impulses that the ego rejects or represses, often projected onto others as faults or enemies. Dreams frequently present shadow figures, often in the form of threatening strangers, animals, or dark forces. To engage the inner world is to confront the shadow, to recognize that what we despise in others often mirrors something within ourselves. This confrontation is not easy, but it is essential, for without it, the individual remains fragmented, trapped in denial and projection. By integrating the shadow, one gains authenticity and strength, recognizing that wholeness includes both light and darkness. The soul, through dreams and symbols, continually urges us to face the shadow, not to be destroyed by it, but to transform it, turning hidden energy into creative power. At the same time, the inner world reveals figures of light and guidance, such as the wise old man, the great mother, or the child. These archetypes symbolize wisdom, nurturing, renewal, and innocence, appearing in dreams or visions to offer direction. Jung emphasized that these figures should not be worshipped as external gods, but engaged as symbols of the self, the deeper center of the psyche, guiding us toward individuation. The inner world thus contains both danger and promise, shadow and light, chaos and order. By navigating this world with openness, the individual learns to hold these opposites together, discovering a deeper harmony that transcends dualities. Art, myth, and religion also serve as collective explorations of the inner world. Jung saw myths not as primitive errors, but as symbolic narratives expressing archetypal truths. Creation myths, hero journeys, stories of death and resurrection, all mirrored the psychic processes of transformation. For example, the hero's descent into the underworld reflected the individual's descent into the unconscious, facing trials, integrating shadow, and returning with new wisdom. Religious rituals similarly provided symbolic structures for engaging the inner world, offering images and practices that guided the soul toward wholeness. Even modern art, Jung noted, often reveals unconscious patterns with abstract forms and surreal images expressing archetypal realities. To engage with art and myth is thus to engage with the collective unconscious, to recognize in cultural symbols the same forces that shape individual dreams and imagination. Jung's own life illustrated the power of the inner world. During a period of personal crisis, he plunged into his unconscious through active imagination, recording his visions and dialogues in journals that later became the Red Book. He encountered figures, landscapes, and symbols that shaped his entire psychological system, convincing him that the unconscious was not merely personal, but a source of profound wisdom and creativity. He realized that exploring the inner world was not a retreat from reality, but a way of grounding oneself more deeply in it, for by engaging with unconscious symbols, he discovered insights that transformed his understanding of humanity, religion, and psychology. His example demonstrates that the exploration of the inner world is not only for patients or dreamers, but for anyone willing to listen to the soul. The transformation that results from engaging the inner world is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating the conscious and unconscious. Dreams, symbols, and active imagination are not ends in themselves, but means of guiding this process. They reveal what is missing, what is hidden, what is needed for growth. They challenge the ego's assumptions and open it to the greater self, the archetype of wholeness that unites all opposites. Individuation does not eliminate conflict or suffering, but gives them meaning, showing how they contribute to the unfolding of the whole person. It is the journey of the soul, guided by the language of the unconscious toward the realization of the self. By exploring the inner world, one discovers that life is not random or meaningless, but filled with symbolic depth, that every dream, every image, every encounter with shadow or light is part of a greater pattern leading toward integration. In this sense, the exploration of the inner world is both a psychological necessity and a spiritual vocation. It teaches us to honor dreams as messages, to see symbols as bridges, to practice imagination as dialogue with the soul. It reveals that the unconscious is not a chaos to be feared, but a partner in growth, filled with wisdom that complements the conscious mind. It reminds us that we are more than our ego identities, that within us lies a vast landscape of archetypes, myths, and divine images calling us toward wholeness. To enter this world is to embark on a journey of transformation, where every symbol becomes a guide, every dream a teacher, and every act of imagination a step closer to the self.